Okay, so moving on to the next segment of today's show, I wanted to talk about the game that occurred on Sunday between Richmond and Kentucky. And Richmond, if you missed it, went into Rupp Arena and got the big time win over Kentucky by a final score of 76-64. And I just wanted to say, Richmond deserves so much credit for the way they were able to go into Rupp Arena and really just dominate this game. And I do believe that this game and the results do say a lot about what could possibly happen in college basketball this season. And I'm going to tell you why, even though when you see the score and you're going to think to yourself, how did Richmond just go into Rupp Arena and beat Kentucky by 12 points? I'm going to tell you guys why you shouldn't be that surprised about this game and everything that went down. Because the way I saw it, Richmond looked like the better team, and they looked like they really deserved to win. And Richmond is a team that returns basically everyone from a team that last year would have made the NCAA tournament if the pandemic didn't happen. And one of the main things I realized from watching this Richmond-Kentucky game was that Richmond players were just really confident, especially in this environment, which not everyone could really say when they go into Rupp Arena and take on Kentucky. And Richmond, you look across their roster, right? They don't really have NBA players per se. Their guards are small, but there are some really good college players on that team. And once again, one of the main things I really was able to notice in this game was just how confident the Richmond players were. They went into Rupp Arena, played a great game, and it's funny because a lot of times, right, we see a Kentucky team just like this one that is filled with loaded freshmen all across the board, and we could say to ourselves, okay, they lose to Evansville, they lose to Utah, they lose a non-conference game that, to be honest, they have really no business losing, and we'll say, oh, that was just a fluke loss, the other team got hot, we couldn't hit a free throw, and a lot of times, like last year, that was the case. If you remember, Kentucky loses to Evansville, they lose to Utah, and then Evansville literally could not win another game the rest of the season. The program literally fell apart as Walter McCarty is no longer the head coach there. And at the same time, Kentucky really was able to establish themselves as one of the better teams in college basketball, the best team in the SEC, and they ended up winning that conference. So Kentucky really last year was able to flip the script after a tough loss. But that wasn't the case in this game on Sunday. There was nothing fluky about this loss. Richmond is a legitimate top 20 team, and after the game, you're going to look at the score and see, oh, Richmond won by 12. At least it was close, and Kentucky were trading punches with them in the first half. Nah, Richmond literally outplayed Kentucky on every side of the ball in every stat, and they just deserve so much credit. Because if you watch the game, Kentucky looked good early. And to be honest, I wanted to say that this Kentucky team was different, that they're so deep and so talented compared to years past. And I'm going to tell you guys this. I tweeted it out the other day. I was so high on this Kentucky team that I predicted them to win the national championship in the preseason. And you guys know I have very high standards and tough standards for elite college teams, especially when it's a team like Kentucky that is filled with freshmen. But I remember saying on this show during the SEC preview that I thought this Kentucky team had a chance to be the best Kentucky team since the 2014 team, that went undefeated throughout the whole regular season. But there are just so many freshmen on this team. And no matter how talented B.J. Boston and Terrence Clark are, naturally, freshmen could have some trouble, especially when they're playing against a team like Richmond that is super experienced. And Kentucky, if you're not familiar, there is only one current member of the Kentucky Wildcats who played on the squad last season, and that was Keon Brooks, and he's out. He did not play in this game against Richmond. There are a lot of freshmen on this Kentucky team. There's some transfers on this team, and to his credit, Olivier Sarr looked really good. I feel like yesterday you could have said that Kentucky was at their best when they were feeding Olivier Sarr the ball. But the problem was that they stopped feeding him and really were not able to take advantage of his size and athleticism, and really Kentucky's size and athleticism as a whole. And I feel like early in the game, you could have even made the argument that Richmond was playing a little out of sorts. They weren't exactly sure how to execute in the first half, and I believe that was because Kentucky was really using their strengths to their advantage and exposing that, all right, we're the more athletic team than Richmond, we're the bigger team than Richmond, and if we want to win this game, we're going to have to use that to our advantage. But unfortunately, in the second half, for some reason, Kentucky stopped feeding Olivier Sarr. They really didn't run any offense, and it was the worst case scenario for a team like Kentucky. If you ask the Big Blue Nation going into this season, what were your main concerns? I feel like most of them would have said the same thing, that it's 2020 in an offseason where the pandemic hit. You guys know the practice schedule isn't the same, especially when you're a team full of young new players. The chemistry may be hard, and to be honest, that's exactly what happened in this second half against Richmond. They looked like a team who didn't play together, who didn't scrimmage, who didn't have any exhibition games. They didn't have a normal practice schedule, and to be honest, they just looked like a team that wasn't able to hang with one as good and as experienced and with as good a chemistry as the Richmond Spiders. So with all that being said, that's why I'm going to say that when you factor all these results and all of the things that went down in the second half, I don't think you could look at this game result and be that shocked. Terrence Clark was all right at best. Devin Askew was sloppy. And I'm not saying this criticizing them. It's just the reality. And to be honest, once again, these guys are freshmen playing against a very good and a very experienced Richmond team. So this was not the most surprising result. And Kentucky was all out of sorts in the second half, really, as the game got away from them. And I feel like when I was watching the game, there were 5 different guys out there on the floor for Kentucky that were really trying to win the game by themselves. And in basketball, you hear it a lot of times, right? When you get down by like 8 to 10 points, the announcers will always say the players have to realize that there's no such thing as an 8-point shot. You have to get each point in that deficit back one at a time, 2 at a time, 1 basket at a time. And I feel like Kentucky, like many other young teams we've seen before in college basketball, weren't really able to realize that. And Richmond was just the more focused and the more poised team. If you think about it, they did everything an older, experienced team needs to do in order to upset a young team. They got out of sorts in the second half as the game got away from them, did Kentucky. And once again, 5 guys on that Wildcat squad tried to take the game over themselves. It was bad pass after bad pass, bad shot after bad shot, and there were just a lot of defensive miscues. All of a sudden, you're watching this game and you see Richmond is building that lead, 8-9, and when you want Kentucky just to lock in, especially on the defensive side of the ball, you just see Richmond getting easy bucket after easy bucket and getting cut after cut. And Kentucky, it didn't even help that they couldn't make a free throw either. And I'm not saying this is the end of the world. I'm saying that if you watch the game, it wasn't the most surprising result, and Kentucky better not sit here and sulk because they have a pretty quick turnaround on Tuesday in the Champions Classic against Kansas. And in the big picture, I do think John Calipari and his squad could figure it out. If you remember, last year, Kentucky lost to Evansville, they lost to Utah, and they were able to win the SEC, and they could have won a national championship, I believe, if the NCAA tournament would have happened. And I'm not making excuses here. Richmond was flat out the better team. His team got nervous. If you looked at my preseason top 25, I had Kentucky as a top 5 team. And in my top 25 on Monday, I'm not going to have Kentucky that high. I'll have them at number 20 to 21 in that range. So they're not going to move up until I see them get some wins that are impressive. But at the same time, continuity and chemistry is really going to be a big factor and a big key for the elite teams in college basketball early. And I just want to, say it once again. The college basketball offseason in 2020 has been crazy. It was such a crazy preseason, and the teams that are running it back, especially at the top of college basketball, they have a big advantage. Gonzaga, we're going to talk about them a little bit later in the show and how well they played against Kansas and against Auburn. And the bottom line is that team returns basically the whole squad besides Filip Petrusev, and they have played a lot of basketball together, especially in high-quality, high-level games. Baylor, they're 2-0. I believe they are one of the 2 or 3 best teams in all of college basketball. They return everyone besides Freddie Gillespie. Villanova, I understand they got upset by Virginia Tech, but I think by season's end, they will be one of the 8 or so best teams in college basketball, probably the best team in the Big East, and Virginia Tech just pulled an upset. It happens, and they were able to pull off a really nice win against Arizona State. But Richmond is another one of those teams. They have chemistry. They're a team that really knows each other, and they know what they're supposed to be doing at all times. They're also very well coached, and were really able to execute at Rupp Arena with layups and open threes. That is how you are able to win at Kentucky when you are Richmond. The Wildcats have these young guys and these freshmen that are going to be great NBA players. We all watch the NBA bubble. I don't have any denials about that. But we spend so much time hyping up these freshmen and not enough time talking about the college basketball teams like Richmond that run the whole squad back. Everyone in the media tries to crap on college basketball and say these freshmen are so much better without it. And if they could, yeah, I would want them to go to the NBA and get their second contract as quickly as possible. But I feel like we undersell just how important college basketball is to these players' development. They don't know how good these seniors and juniors on the floor at places like Richmond are, and I feel like we saw that yesterday. It's so hard for a team full of freshmen to win national championships in college because they get on the floor thinking they're great NBA players, and you don't blame them. They've been hyped up throughout their high school careers. But when you're B.J. Boston, when you're Terrence Clark, and you see a Grant Golden on the floor, when you're all the freshmen at Tennessee, Jaden Springer and Keon Johnson, and you see a Johnny Fulkerson or a Yves Pons on the floor, guys that are just grown dudes that have been playing college basketball for 3 years, you're going to be thinking to yourself, how the hell are these guys not in the NBA right now? And I feel like that's kind of what happened with Kentucky yesterday. And this is all normal. This doesn't mean that they're not going to be stars in the NBA, but right away, when you enter college basketball, experience matters, and I feel like that's what the statement win by Richmond showed me yesterday. When Kentucky figures it out, this win is going to look even better for Richmond, and the Atlantic 10 is a legitimately good league. We saw what Richmond was able to do. We saw what the St. Louis Billikens were able to do on Sunday against SEC opponent LSU. So the Atlantic 10 was able to pull off 2 big wins against the SEC this week. And, you have Dayton in that league. You have VCU in that league who beat Memphis. You have Rhode Island in that league who pulled off a win over an ACC opponent this weekend. And I think Kentucky right now has no chemistry, but they will be fine. Kentucky always figures it out, but at the same time, you also have to be careful because there's a really quick turnaround. Kansas, UCLA, Georgia Tech, Louisville, Kentucky is going to have to be prepared for those games. And the bottom line is this game against Richmond was a really good representation of what could happen this season in college basketball.